Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 148 of the Australian Hiker podcast. And in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about Australian bush legends and myths. As part of our cultural identity, Australia, like most other countries, relies on our early European settlement to provide our cultural identity. And this isn't alone. It comes in play along with Indigenous culture as well. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about some of those legends and myths that are well known from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous culture. And while some of these legends and myths have a degree of assuredness and fact, some have a small degree of truth associated with them, and others are just downright fabrications. Whatever the degree of truth is involved, it doesn't stop us from talking about them and, where possible, having a degree of fun at the expense of gullible people, particularly overseas tourists and media personalities. The following myths and legends are some of Australia's best known, although there will be some that you may never have heard of, and there's some that we may not have included. We tried to focus on the nationally recognised and known ones. We hope you enjoy. Now, in no particular order, we're going to go through a series of the main myths and legends that are around. And the first one we're going to look at is Australian bush panthers or pumas. Now, there's been no shortage in news reports over the last 100 years of giant black cats in the bush. And in fact, there's been over 500 reports, and we seem to get these reports coming through on a regular basis.
That's a lot of reports.
It's a lot of reports.
I've never seen a huge black cat in the bush.
And this is one of the things, I suppose, the comment on, if you go online, is for things that are total fabrications or potentially fabrications, this has had a lot of media and a lot of reports coming through. So maybe there is a degree of truth in these sightings. Now, there's two main theories behind these sightings, and these are, at some stage in the past, animals have escaped from either the circus or the zoo, or as one report, that the US military had them over here as mascots, and when they went back to the States after the end of the war, they just released them into the bush and let them go. The other possibility is that they're just large feral cats.
It's a big feral cat.
It's a big feral cat. And certainly the largest one that I came across when I was doing research for this podcast, and this was unconfirmed, was a cat that weighed about 35 kilos and that was about 1.5 metres in length. And I'm guessing that probably included the length of the tail as well. That's big. It wasn't confirmed. But in all honesty, feral cats can get quite large. They can get quite mean looking, and black cats end up in the wild just as much as any other colour. So it is possible that either these have been sightings of large, fast-moving feral cats, or it has been that, as I said, that some things escaped into the wild. There's an example where I came across where there was a historic photo taken from the 1920s that shows a dead puma in one of the newspapers that had been shot after it escaped from a circus. So as unlikely as this is, we've never had any proof to say, yes, they do exist. The possibility still exists in this case. From there, we move on to the next one, which is the Bunyip or the Yowie. Now, America has the Bigfoot and the Sasquatch. The Himalayas, we've got the abominable snowman. And in Australia's perspective, we had the Bunyip or the Yowie. Now, this creature is grounded in Aboriginal culture and goes by different names depending on where you are. and is often associated with waterways. Various descriptions exist, and if you search the web, you'll come up with all sorts of different images about what the bunyips and the yowies look like. There are descriptions, particularly out of Aboriginal culture, that describe these as being half human, half fish, being roughly twice the size of a human. Personality-wise, they've been described from being shy and timid to occasionally being dangerous.
In terms of what they look like, I didn't think that they would be half human, half fish. For some reason, I've heard about bunyips and yowies, or all my adolescence, and I was quite surprised by that.
I was as well, actually. And if you look at online, when I was trying to find some images for these, it was a bit variable, but it wasn't anything that came across looking like a Yeti or a Bigfoot that you often see represented from the States. So it's the image, and I've got images for these in the written version of this podcast, and I'll have the link to that in the show notes. And the image for the bunyip was actually from the late 1800s, and the best way to describe it, this looks like a rabid, large Labrador in a pond with a body in its mouth. So you look online and there's quite different variations in what these things are supposed to look like.
Well, the other thing is that the image that we've got is quite an aggressive one. So saying that it's a shy and timid creature, occasionally dangerous.
Yeah.
When it's dangerous, it's pretty dangerous.
So, you do see a variety of things. And I remember that growing up as a child in the 70s, there was a book that came out in 1972 called The Bunyip That Ate Canberra. And this was a creature that lived in Lake Burley Griffin, which is our central lake.
There are all sorts of things that live in Lake Burley Griffin. I'm not sure that a yowie is one of them.
Now, probably one of the best known myths or legends is the drop bear. We've got a link here that goes to the Australian Museum, and they've given this a name of Thylactos. I'm not going to get this name right here. Thylactos plummetus, and I think the plummetus means they drop from trees. Now, these closely resemble koalas and live in the same habitat, and this is where the problem arises. While koalas are quite happy to sit in trees and chew leaves, these things wait for unsuspecting passers-by to drop down on people and attack.
Usually tourists,
and in particular American tourists.
Funnily enough.
And then, the description here is the impact often stuns the prey and it allows them to bite the neck, and the prey is quickly subdued. Now, I know, talking to a friend that had a bit of fun with the American military when they came over, and he was in the Australian Army, and he'd convinced everyone that he was with from America that the only thing that would protect you was a pair of mirrored sunglasses. And this entire Australian platoon all had mirrored sunglasses just to keep the roost going. So, it's the sort of thing that it can be quite amusing. And as I said, on the written version of this, I've got a Scottish reporter had a bit of fun with reportedly holding a drop bear and her reaction to it. So it's worthwhile going online and having a look at that. Now, the next one is probably not so well known, and this is something from my father's or grandfather's generation, and these are hoop snakes. And in fact, the image we've got online here is actually quite an old image. And hoop snakes are one of these things, they get their names from when they're threatened. They will grab hold of their tail and form a hoop, and they'll come rolling after you. Reportedly, it speeds it up to 60 kilometres an hour.
Oh, that's pretty serious.
And before biting you. Now, if they're only scared, they might just crawl away like other snakes, but when they're threatened, they virtually turn into a hula hoop and come chasing after you. I don't think this is one that many younger people in Australia would be aware of, and it's only something that even even with my age, I was only vaguely aware of as a child. So it's the hoop snake supposedly is present in a number of places around the world.
Yeah, this is one I don't recall hearing about. So yeah, I think it's probably gone out of fashion a little bit.
It is. And the book I've actually got the image out of from this one, and it's an American book, and they have all sorts of strange, weird and wonderful animals that you've never seen of or heard of before. So it's quite a good little source. And again, the link I'll put the link in the show notes to that one. Now, moving back to Indigenous culture again, we've got Min Min lights. And this is a series of unexplained lighting phenomena, and it's best described as fast-moving or floating balls of light. Some people believe, or some Indigenous people believe, this is the spirits of the elders looking for their country. Another thought is that they also distract people that come across them and make them get lost. So you'll hear different views on different parts of Australia. There's actually a shire in Queensland that promotes these as a tourism feature. So if you happen to be passing through, they suggest that you've got about a 120-kilometre stretch where you can come across these lights. Now, the last one we're going to talk about is, and again, this is probably one of our better-known one, is Tasmanian tigers. Now, the fact that these actually existed is not a myth or legend. They did exist. The Tasmanian tiger was, as far as the species was concerned, was declared extinct in 1936. And this was an Australian marsupial carnivore, which means they had a pouch, a bit like kangaroos. And as a creature, they've been around as far back as 30 million years ago, but the modern species that we have come to know has been around for about 4 million years. They were spread across much of Australia, and certainly by the time the European settlers arrived, they were very much limited more so to Tasmania. And the thought was that the introduction of the dingo greatly reduced their numbers. And certainly from a European perspective, they were often seen to be taking lambs and stock. So there was a bounty put on them. And in the late 1800s, there were 2,000 bounties paid out, which probably accounted for just about everything else that was remaining population-wise. Now, it's interesting through this one here, looking up and getting the information for the podcast. The more you read on it, it's one of these species that was probably never going to survive long term. It wasn't a particularly effective predator. It relied on small prey, like possums and bandicoots. It was thought to hunt larger prey like kangaroos, but only in a pack. Whereas if you look at dingoes, they will pack hunt as well as hunt as individuals, but they're more than capable of taking down a reasonable sized wallaby or a smaller kangaroo by themselves. So now they were always in a bit of a losing battle when a new species comes in, or when, in the case of humans, we decide we're going to kill them off.
Yeah.
Over the last couple of weeks, we've reviewed a movie called The Hunter, and that's the storyline behind that is the Tasmanian tiger. So if you're into Tasmanian wilderness and into the thoughts of Tasmanian tigers, this movie puts them together. And I think in the case of the tigers, again, I think there's probably the jury is still out in a lot of cases on this one. Tasmania is so remote in some of the wilderness areas and so hard to get to. The view is that they may still exist in some of the remote areas, but no concrete evidence has been provided since 1936 that they still exist.
Yeah, it'd be nice to think so, but if there are no sightings, is it possible? Or is everyone just keeping it quiet because they don't want everyone to know? That's another conspiracy theory.
Okay, so as we said, some of these myths and legends are real, and some may have some elements of truth, while others are just downright fabrications. But it doesn't stop us having a bit of fun, and it doesn't stop us from imagining that the Tasmanian tiger or the giant Australian panther does exist. Again, until we find them or fail to find them, you never know.
Well, that's a bit inconclusive, isn't it?
It is. It is. Okay, from a news perspective, as this podcast goes to air in mid-May 2020, one of the biggest news in relation to hiking is concerned is that either over the last weekend or this coming weekend, that a lot of the states and territories are starting to open up national parks and reserves.
Yay.
Here in Canberra, as an example, Tidbinbilla Nature Reserve, which is one of our more formalised reserves, is open again on Friday, just after we released this podcast. They opened it up recently after the fires and closed it very quickly when 500 people turned up on one day, and they decided that given the coronavirus, they were trying to minimise the impact. So again, open again, and a lot of states and territories are doing the same. They're opening their national parks, they're opening their territories, they're opening their reserves. Which
is fantastic, but we just have to kind of pace ourselves and not go crazy.
The other thing that's it's worthwhile keeping in mind as well is we still have a number of areas that have been greatly impacted by the fires, and I'm hoping to actually get out to some of those areas in the coming weeks just to see what impact has happened on the bush and how things are recovering. Unfortunately, the pandemic has stopped me doing that, and what I was hoping to release in mid-March has been delayed for quite a while. Okay, that's all for this week's episode. Not a long one by any means. In next week's episode, we're doing a series of interviews with an Australian-based travel company and a couple of hikers on the Kumano Kudo track, and excuse my pronunciation here. This is a World Heritage Trail or pilgrimage trail in Japan. And it's actually a series of trails that takes in a lot of the older temples. It's a hike I've been trying to talk to people about for a while, and the stars have aligned over this coming week, and I'll be presenting a series of 3 separate interviews in the next episode to provide a bit more information. Now, I know that we can't actually travel anywhere at the moment, but this is to provide a bit of a whet the appetite and get people considering this is a possibility for next year's Northern Hemisphere spring, summer and autumn period.
Yeah, so when we can go, we go, but at the moment we can't. All we can do is plan, which is a good thing to do. But
It is. And don't forget, if you have the opportunity, please go through and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or your podcast listener of choice. That'll help us get the message out there. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.
Now, if you've spent much time in Australia, you'll be aware that, like most other countries, we have a series of legends and myths that form. If you've spent much time in Australia, you'll be aware that, like most other countries, we have a series of So, we over the last couple of weeks we've renewed.